Professor Raman Murthy, Professor C.P. Chandrasekhar, Professor Upadhyay, Professor Surajit Majumdar, the delegates to the Indian Political Economy Association's Congress, students, teachers, friends. First of all, I'm very grateful that I have been given this opportunity to address this inaugural session. The topic on which I was asked to speak is really the global economy. Whenever we think of the global economy these days, we always tend to think of the pandemic and the ensuing developments. As a matter of fact, even before the pandemic, world capitalism had got into a very serious crisis, particularly starting from the collapse of the housing bubble in the United States in 2008. And that is related to structural problems with neoliberalism, which tend to get swept under the carpet, tend to get hidden if we concentrate attention only on the pandemic. Therefore, I would rather not talk about the pandemic, whose effects are very well known, but rather concentrate on the structural crisis of world capitalism, because even after the effects of the pandemic are over, we would still be with that structural crisis. Now, the structural crisis of world capitalism is related to the neoliberal phase of this capitalism. We know that, in fact, Professor D.N. Reddy referred to it. We know that there has been a tremendous increase in inequality during the period of neoliberal capitalism. The question is, why has this increase taken place? Fundamentally, to my mind, it's because of the fact that the relocation of a number of activities from the advanced capitalist world to the third world, countries like India, China, Indonesia, Vietnam, etc., this relocation to cheaper, to lower wage countries is something which has, on the one hand, made the entire conditions of the working class all over the world linked to the existence of the massive third world labor reserves. Because obviously in the United States, you cannot demand higher wages, because in such a case, you'd find that activities would shift to the third world, where you actually have much lower wages. So the American workers' wages or the British workers' wages are no longer now unrelated to the fact that in the third world, there are massive labor reserves. On the other hand, within the third world, even though there is this relocation of activities that is taking place, these labor reserves, far from getting exhausted, are actually getting added to. That there is an increase in the relative size of the labor reserves, partly because neoliberalism inflicts an agrarian crisis everywhere, which makes large numbers of peasants and petty producers leave their traditional occupations and move to cities in the quest of employment. And on the other hand, neoliberalism quickens the rate of introduction of technological progress, the rate of increase in labor productivity, to a degree where even though GDP growth rate may have gone up, as it has in our economy in the neoliberal period, employment growth rate tends to stagnate. As a matter of fact, in our own country, while roughly speaking, GDP growth rate has doubled compared to what it was before liberalization, employment growth rate has virtually halved compared to what it was before liberalization, so much so that employment growth rate now falls short of the growth rate of population and therefore the workforce, let alone absorb the peasants flocking to the cities in quest of employment. Therefore, all over the world, the working class's living standards tend to be constrained by the existence and even the growth of the massive labor reserves. Therefore, you find that the vector of real wages, whether it is in America or in Britain or in EU, does not increase, nor do the real wages increase much in the third world. As a matter of fact, if you look at the statistics, the only country where real wages have increased noticeably in the recent period is, of course, China. The only big country where they have increased in the recent period is China, and there they have increased, not necessarily because of labor shortage, but they have increased because of the government's policy decision to raise real wages. Therefore, what happens is that the real wages the vector of real wages, I'm not saying they get equalized all over the world, but the vector of real wages tends to remain more or less fixed or stagnant, while, of course, everywhere you have an enormous increase in the rate of growth of labor productivity. That gives rise to an increase in the share of economic surplus in the world economy and, of course, even in individual particular economies. Now, this is what lies at the root of the increase in inequality. The greater the share of surplus, the greater the incomes of those who live off the surplus. And this is something which shows itself in terms of even an increase in inequality measured by Gini coefficients or other things. Now, therefore, putting it differently, all over the world, liberalization or neoliberalism has brought in the hegemony of finance under neoliberalism, has brought in a tremendous shift in the balance of class forces away from the working people, by which I mean the workers and peasants, towards the monopoly capitalists, towards the corporate financial oligarchy. This has happened in almost every capitalist country. And of course, this is true at the world level when you aggregate the picture. Now, this has a very important implication. If you have a shift that is taking place from, let us say, from the incomes of the working people to the incomes of the corporate financial oligarchy, a rupee, let us say, is transferred from the former to the latter, then this implies that there is a reduction in consumption because of this transfer, because the propensity to consume out of a rupee that is in the hands of the working people is much higher than the propensity to consume out of a rupee in the hands of the rich, in the hands of the monopoly capitalists or the corporate oligarchy. Therefore, this tends to have an ex ante overproduction effect. There is a tendency to move towards an ex ante crisis of overproduction. Why do I say ex ante? Because it is conceivable, and we have been told by Keynesian economics that this ex ante tendency would actually be checked, would be restrained through state intervention. Keynes's entire contribution was to say that, really speaking, state intervention must be there in order to ensure that economies remain close to full employment. As a matter of fact, however, this is the other aspect of globalization. Since globalization entails the globalization of capital and the globalization especially of finance, the autonomy of the nation state in intervening in a particular situation to boost aggregate demand is something which is taken away. We live, in other words, in a world in which finance and capital are globalized, but the state remains a nation state. That being the case, the nation state is constrained to act according to the caprices of finance, because otherwise finance being globalized can actually leave the nation state. Now, one of the things that finance wants is that it is really opposed to fiscal deficits. It is also opposed to taxation of the capitalists, whether in the form of corporate or in the form of wealth taxation, which is not surprising. Therefore, what you find is that the only two instruments fiscally available to any nation state to intervene for raising the level of aggregate demand, namely either through larger taxation of the rich or through a fiscal deficit, are really not available to the state. If a state taxes 100 rupees, taxes the working people by 100 rupees, takes 100 rupees away from them and spends it, in that case, there is hardly any addition to aggregate demand, because the 100 rupees taken away from the working people would be reducing demand more or less exactly to the same tune as the increase in government expenditure raises aggregate demand. So it's really something where, if you like, the effect of the balanced budget multiplier, the value is zero. The fiscal intervention by the government really raises aggregate demand only if you have either taxation of the corporates and the rich in order to finance larger government expenditure, or a fiscal deficit, which means nobody is taxed, in order to finance larger government expenditures. Now, both the latter avenues being closed in the era of neoliberal capitalism, you therefore find that the capacity of the state to intervene, the way Keynes had suggested, to raise the level of aggregate demand, to offset the ex-ante crisis or tendency towards overproduction, is something which is subverted, something which is negated. Therefore, it's not surprising that there has been a slowing down of the world economy. As a matter of fact, the decadal growth rate in the world economy in the period just before the pandemic was the lowest among all the decades after the Second World War, which is really symptomatic of what has been happening under neoliberalism. If it happened now and not earlier, it's because of the fact that a set of bubbles, first the dot-com bubble in the United States, followed by the housing bubble in the United States, actually tended to give an artificial boost, temporary boost to the US economy, therefore the world economy. But on the other hand, with the collapse of the housing bubble, now no bubble has come to take its place, which is why, once more, the world economy is now submerged in a prolonged crisis. This crisis may not be visible clearly in terms of unemployment rates, though it will be visible in Europe, but not in the United States, because of the fact that there has been a sharp decline in the participation rate, in the labor participation rate, because of the discouraged worker effect. And for that reason, you find that the unemployment rate, strictly speaking, is somewhat reduced. But if you make adjustments for that, then you find that the US economy, the unemployment rate is again higher than appears at first sight, and really is fairly high. Now, therefore, what is the way out as far as world capitalism is concerned? Obviously, individual nation states intervening in the economy is something which is not possible, because you would find that there would be an exodus of finance from that nation state that actually carries out expansionary policies. And that being the case, the one suggestion that one can think of is a coordinated action by large numbers of nation states, particularly the advanced country nation states, to have an expansion in the world economy. This is something which had been suggested in the 1930s by Keynes and a set of German trade unions who had actually wanted a coordinated fiscal stimulus at the world level. It was not implemented, but on the other hand, it was something which had been suggested. Ironically, in the current crisis, nobody has even suggested it, which is quite amazing. Nonetheless, efforts have been on for some time, certainly by the United States, the largest capitalist country, to do something about this crisis, because that is something which is bringing great hardships to the American working people, which has an electoral impact on whichever party is running the country. Donald Trump's suggestion for overcoming the crisis in the United States was really protectionism. Now, then Trump introduced protectionism. Actually, his protectionism has been introduced or getting introduced for a very long time. Even Obama did it, but Donald Trump carried it further and introduced protection against Chinese goods and so on. But the problem with protectionism is that protectionism simply exports unemployment. That instead of unemployment being in the United States, you raise activity because of protectionism, unemployment falls, but unemployment gets generated elsewhere in the world, those countries against whom you have protected yourself. Therefore, protectionism is not really a way of overcoming the crisis of the world economy. Protectionism is what used to be called the introduction of beggar my neighbor policies, that I basically become better off by making my neighbor into a beggar. Therefore, protectionism of the Trump period is something which really is no panacea as far as the world economy is concerned, world capitalism is concerned. For the world capitalism, it is important that there be an increase in world demand. Now, an increase in world demand, as I mentioned, by individual countries taking action to do so is something which is really not possible in the era of hegemony of finance capital. But the United States actually occupies a special position in the world economy, because if India enlarges fiscal deficit, Moody's would run down India's credit rating, finance would start leaving India. But if the United States enlarges its fiscal deficit or started taxing capitalists, in that case, finance is unlikely to leave the United States because the dollar is still considered as good as gold. The US is still considered the basic home of international finance capital. That's why when Biden came to power, Biden actually had a fairly ambitious program of enlarging US government expenditures to be financed by taxing the rich, higher corporate taxation, and of course also by enlarging the fiscal deficit. The excuse for enlarging the fiscal deficit had been provided by the pandemic, during which all fiscal deficits, except in third world countries like India, increased. In the US, it was very large, and then they carried on with that higher fiscal deficit even in the period when the pandemic had subsided. Additionally, Biden wanted to raise the rate of corporate taxation. But as you know, Biden's effort to raise corporate taxes, for which you need an international understanding, really was not very successful. They wanted a minimum corporate tax rate internationally of 25%, but they ended up with only 15%, which is really very low. But now, even with that corporate tax rate, and even with an enlarged fiscal deficit, even though there is huge unemployment in the United States and unutilized capacity, inflation had begun to make its appearance. And this inflation, particularly in oil prices, is now becoming quite serious because of the war in Ukraine. Therefore, this is something which is now holding back the any possible economic recovery in the capitalist world. But as I said, the problem is not only the Ukraine war. The problem is not only the pandemic. The problem is deeper. And that is the last point I want to make. That basically the Ukraine war would be over sooner or later. Basically, the pandemic, let us say, would subside. But after that, when you have an enlargement of the fiscal deficit, let us say, or you have larger activity in the advanced countries, then this is going to make itself felt in terms of some increase in inflationary pressures. Inflation is anathema, is thoroughly disliked by finance capital, because the real value of financial assets goes down, and therefore finance capital is always vehemently opposed to inflation, which is why you have all this inflation targeting being a very important feature of the contemporary capitalist or contemporary world capitalism. Now, the moment inflation begins to make itself felt, you'd find that the impact of this inflation or the origin of this inflation would naturally be traced to all kinds of uh, raw material or raw materials, primary commodities, and so on, which are produced in a number of third world countries, or produced significantly in a number of third world countries. Therefore, the effort would be to actually have inflation control in the third world through fiscal restraint while you have an enlargement of the fiscal deficit and activities in the first world. In fact, during the pandemic itself, when the IMF was telling the advanced or allowing the advanced countries or encouraging them to spend more, even financed by fiscal deficits, it was actually imposing austerity. Oxfam made a study of 86 third world countries which actually had uh, approached the IMF for rolling over their debt. You know, they couldn't pay back whatever was due from their debt, their international debt. Therefore, they approached the IMF to roll over their debts. And when they did so, the IMF made it a condition that they follow policies of fiscal austerity. Therefore, fiscal expansionism in the north may well be accompanied by enforced fiscal austerity in the south. If so, then we would be seeing a new kind of partitioning of the world, a new kind of hiatus in the world in which if we don't have colonialism anymore, we don't have direct political control by the north over the south anymore, but nonetheless, through these kinds of policies, neoliberal policies imposed by the IMF, relaxation of the fiscal rigidities in the north that would allow them to increase their level of activity, but on the other hand, a greater rigidity in the south that would actually mean that the third world countries, instead of benefiting from the expansion of the north, would remain squeezed, would in fact become even worse off than they were before. Therefore, I believe that contemporary world economy would either remain submerged in a kind of crisis even after the effects of the Ukraine war and the pandemic are over, or efforts to get out of this might actually take the form of a deepening hiatus within the world economy in which the working people of the third world, I don't mean countries, I mean, I think the Adanis and the Ambanis would continue doing well. The working people of the third world would be special victims. This is a situation we have to be prepared for and we have to fight against and understand. Thank you very much for your patience.